The $50 bill landed on the counter in 2 pieces, torn cleanly down the middle, and Lila Blake's hand froze halfway to the cash drawer as she noticed the ink bleeding through the paper, handwriting that didn't belong on currency. Her eyes lifted to meet the customer's gaze, but the woman in the navy coat was already turning away, disappearing into the Tuesday afternoon crowd. Lila's fingers trembled as she pressed the torn halves together beneath the fluorescent light of her ticket booth, the words forming a message that made her blood run cold. Bomb on train. Betrayal. Don't board. The terminal hummed with its usual chaos, announcements echoing off marble walls, the rhythmic clatter of departure boards, tourists photographing the celestial ceiling while commuters surged toward platforms. Nobody noticed the ticket clerk whose world had just tilted sideways, whose Tuesday routine had transformed into something that smelled like gasoline and fear. Lila had worked this booth for 3 years, selling tickets to destinations she'd never see, watching the same faces pass through her small window like clockwork. The lawyers with their leather briefcases, the students with their oversized headphones, the elderly couples who still dressed up for travel. She knew their schedules better than her own. But one passenger had carved himself into her consciousness with the precision of a scalpel, appearing every Tuesday at exactly 2:47 p.m. to purchase a ticket on the 3:15 Express. He never smiled, never made small talk, never looked at his phone while waiting. Dorian Maddox wore suits that cost more than her monthly rent, custom-tailored in charcoal and midnight blue, always paired with shoes polished to a mirror shine. His dark hair was cut with mathematical precision, and his eyes, slate gray and impossibly cold, swept the terminal with the vigilance of someone who trusted nothing. She'd learned his name from the credit card he'd used once when the ticket machine malfunctioned, the black metal card that hit her counter with the weight of something more than plastic. Dorian Maddox. The name had felt dangerous even then, belonging to someone who existed in spaces where ordinary rules bent or broke entirely. Lila glanced at the clock mounted above her booth, 2:46 p.m. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she folded the torn bill into her palm, the paper warm from the previous owner's fear. In exactly 1 minute, he would arrive, and she would have to make a decision that could save his life or end her own. The message wasn't meant for her. It was meant for him, passed through her hands like a relay in a race she didn't know she'd entered. The terminal's energy shifted subtly as he appeared, the crowd parting unconsciously around him, the way water splits around stone. Dorian moved with the contained grace of a predator, his presence filling spaces without effort. He approached her window with the same measured stride he always used, his expression revealing nothing as he reached into his jacket pocket. Lila's breath caught in her throat, her fingers tightening around the torn bill hidden in her palm. Their eyes met through the glass partition, and for the first time in 3 years of Tuesdays, something flickered across his features. A question, perhaps, or recognition of the fear she couldn't quite hide. His hand emerged holding crisp bills, the transaction as routine as breathing. "1 ticket for the 3:15 Express," Dorian said, his voice low and smooth, carrying an accent she'd never been able to place. It was the voice of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. Lila's hand shook as she reached for the bills, her mind racing through impossible scenarios. If she gave him the torn note, he might think she was threatening him. Men like Dorian Maddox didn't respond well to threats. If she said nothing, he would board that train, and whatever waited, there would detonate along with dozens of innocent lives. The woman in the navy coat had trusted her with this message, had chosen her booth out of all the others. She processed his payment with mechanical precision, her training taking over while her thoughts spiraled, the ticket printed with its usual mechanical whir, the sound suddenly deafening in her compressed world of glass and fear. Lila slid the ticket across the counter, and then, before courage could abandon her entirely, she placed the torn $50 bill on top of it, her eyes locked with his, willing him to understand, to read the urgency she couldn't speak aloud without drawing attention from the cameras mounted in every corner. Dorian's gaze dropped to the torn bill, his hand hovering above it for a fraction of a second, before his fingers closed around both the ticket and the currency. His expression remained perfectly neutral, but Lila saw the muscles in his jaw tighten, a tell so subtle she would have missed it if she hadn't spent 3 years studying his face. He didn't unfold the bill immediately, didn't react beyond slipping both items into his jacket pocket with the casual efficiency of someone performing an ordinary transaction. But his eyes found hers again, holding her captive in their gray depths, asking questions she couldn't answer through glass and fear. "Thank you," Dorian said, the words carrying weight they'd never held before in their countless exchanges. Then he turned and walked away, not toward the platform, but toward the restrooms near the east corridor. Lila's hands gripped the edge of her counter, her knuckles white as she watched him disappear into the flow of travelers. She'd done what the woman in the navy coat had trusted her to do, passed the message to its intended recipient. The minutes crawled past like hours as Lila processed other customers on autopilot, her responses mechanical, while her mind remained locked on the man who'd vanished into the terminal's maze. A businessman complained about schedule changes. A teenager asked for directions. A mother juggled tickets and strollers. All of it background noise to the drumbeat of her racing heart. At 2:53 p.m., Dorian emerged from the corridor, his phone pressed to his ear, his stride purposeful as he moved not toward the platform, but toward the station master's office. Lila watched him speak to the uniformed official, watched the man's face shift from annoyed to alarmed. Within minutes, transit police appeared, their movements coordinated and swift, fanning out across the terminal with radios crackling. The 3:15 express flashed on the departure board with a new status: delayed, mechanical inspection. Passengers groaned and checked their watches, oblivious to the disaster that had just been averted by a torn bill and a ticket clerk's trembling hands. Dorian stood near the information kiosk, his phone still pressed to his ear, his eyes scanning the crowd with predatory focus. Lila realized with sudden clarity that he was looking for someone, the traitor, the one who'd planted the bomb, the person who'd tried to eliminate him in the most public way possible. The message had said betrayal, which meant the threat came from inside his circle, from someone close enough to know his schedule. The terminal's atmosphere shifted as more security personnel arrived, their presence carefully orchestrated to avoid panic while they swept through platforms and maintenance areas. Dorian's phone call ended, and he slipped the device back into his pocket with the same deliberate precision he applied to everything. Then he turned, his gaze finding her booth across the expanse of marble and hurrying bodies, and Lila felt the full weight of his attention settle on her like a physical touch. He started walking toward her window, each step measured and purposeful, and she knew with absolute certainty that her life had just changed in ways she couldn't begin to calculate. The customers in line parted without being asked, some primitive instinct warning them away from the man who moved like violence contained in expensive fabric. Dorian reached her window and leaned forward slightly, close enough that she could see the flecks of darker gray in his eyes. "The terminal closes at midnight," he said quietly, his words pitched for her ears alone despite the glass barrier between them. "Meet me at the oyster bar downstairs at 12:15. Come alone, tell no one, and bring nothing that can track you." Before Lila could respond, before she could even process the impossibility of what he was asking, Dorian straightened and walked away, disappearing into the crowd as thoroughly as smoke dissipating in wind. Her shift didn't end until 11, which meant she had hours to decide whether to be terrified or intrigued. The departure board updated again. The 3:15 express was officially canceled. Passengers directed to alternative routes. Transit police continued their sweep, moving with the choreographed efficiency of professionals executing a plan. Nobody was running, nobody was screaming, but Lila could taste the tension in the recycled air. She processed the next customer with hands that had finally stopped shaking, her mind replaying every second of Dorian's brief appearance at her window. The oyster bar at 12:15, a meeting that felt less like an invitation and more like a summons from a world she'd only glimpsed through glass. The woman in the navy coat had started something Lila couldn't stop, had thrown her into the orbit of a man whose very presence suggested consequences. The torn bill had been a bridge between her ordinary existence and whatever darkness Dorian Maddox inhabited, and she'd crossed it without hesitation, driven by something that felt disturbingly close to purpose. Dorian stood in the empty conference room of the building he owned 3 blocks from Grand Central. The Manhattan skyline spread before him like a kingdom he'd conquered one calculated move at a time. His empire had been built on information, leverage, and the absolute certainty that loyalty could be bought, sold, or eliminated, depending on the circumstances. The torn bill lay on the mahogany table, its 2 halves pressed together to reveal the warning that had saved his life. Bomb on train, betrayal, don't board. The handwriting belonged to his accountant's assistant, a woman named Iris who'd worked in his organization for 8 years without ever drawing attention to herself. His phone buzzed with an incoming text from his head of security. Iris Calloway had been found in her apartment, dead for approximately 6 hours. A single bullet through the back of her skull. Professional, clean, meant to look like a random act of violence in a city that swallowed tragedies whole. Dorian poured himself 2 fingers of bourbon, the amber liquid catching the light from the floor-to-ceiling windows. Iris had known about the bomb, had known about the betrayal, and had used her final moments to tear a $50 bill in half and scrawl a warning she'd somehow gotten to the one person who could reach him. The ticket clerk with the careful hands and watchful eyes had been Iris's chosen messenger, a civilian pulled into a war she couldn't possibly understand. Lila Blake. He'd learned her name from the terminal's employee database within minutes of reading the warning. Lived alone in a studio apartment in Queens, worked 40 hours a week selling tickets, and had no criminal record beyond a parking ticket from 2 years ago. She was unremarkable in every quantifiable way, the kind of person who moved through the world without leaving ripples. Yet she'd looked into his eyes and handed him a torn bill with hands that shook, but didn't hesitate, understanding somehow that silence was survival. Dorian's second in command, a man named Cole Brennan, entered the conference room without knocking, his expression grim. They'd known each other since childhood, had built this empire together from nothing, and Cole's presence was the only constant in a world of shifting allegiances. The bomb was sophisticated, Cole reported, dropping a manila folder on the table beside the torn bill. Military-grade C4, remotely detonated, placed in the cargo compartment of the 315 Express. We found it during the mechanical inspection and handed everything over to contacts at the NYPD who owe us favors. Dorian studied the surveillance photos spread across the table, images of the device that would have vaporized him and 43 other passengers. The trigger was a cell phone, which meant someone had planned to watch him board before initiating the sequence. Personal, vindictive, and arrogant. "The traitor wanted to see me die," Dorian said, his voice devoid of emotion while rage burned cold beneath his sternum. "Which means they're still in the city, still watching, still convinced they can finish what they started." Cole moved to the window, his reflection ghosting over the Manhattan skyline. Iris Calloway's phone records show she made 1 call yesterday to an unlisted number. Scrambled, bounced through 3 proxies. Someone warned her, gave her enough information to act. The pieces of the puzzle shifted in Dorian's mind, forming patterns that suggested conspiracy within his carefully constructed hierarchy. Someone close enough to know his schedule, his routes, his Tuesday ritual of riding the express train to the upstate offices that narrowed the field of suspects considerably. Pull surveillance footage from Grand Central between 2:30 and 2:50 today, Dorian ordered, his mind already moving through contingencies and countermoves. "I want to see who Iris Calloway passed that bill to, how many hands it went through before it reached the ticket clerk." Cole nodded, already reaching for his phone to make the necessary calls. "What about the girl? Lila Blake? She's a loose end, a witness who can connect you to a warning about a bomb that officially doesn't exist." Dorian's fingers traced the edge of the torn bill, remembering the fear and determination warring in Lila's dark eyes. She'd risked herself without hesitation, had understood the urgency without explanation, and had trusted that he would read Iris's desperate final message correctly. "The girl is meeting me at the Oyster Bar at 12:15, Dorian said quietly, his decision already made despite every rule he'd built his empire on. "She saved my life, which means she's either the bravest person I've ever met, or a pawn in a game she doesn't understand. Either way, I need to know which." Cole's expression shifted to concern, the kind reserved for moments when Dorian made choices that prioritized curiosity over caution. "You're walking into an unknown variable. She could be part of this, could be setting you up for whatever comes next." Dorian drained his bourbon, the burn a welcome distraction from the chaos spinning beneath his controlled exterior. "If Lila Blake wanted me dead, she would have kept that torn bill in her pocket and watched me board the train. Instead, she handed it over despite every camera in that terminal recording her movements. The city stretched endlessly beyond the windows, millions of lives intersecting and diverging in patterns too complex to predict. Somewhere in that vast network, a traitor was celebrating a failed assassination, unaware that Dorian Maddox was now hunting them, with the focused intensity of someone who'd been reminded that mortality still applied even to kings. His phone buzzed again, a text from his technology specialist confirming that Lila Blake's phones, email, and social media had been scrubbed from any connection to his organization. She would remain clean, protected by the same resources that made his empire invisible to those who preferred not to see. Dorian glanced at his watch. 8 hours until midnight. 8 hours until he met the woman who'd altered the trajectory of his carefully ordered existence, with a torn bill and trembling hands. The Oyster Bar would be empty by then, the terminal settling into its late-night rhythm of cleaners and security patrols. He would learn everything about Lila Blake, her fears, her motivations, her understanding of what she'd stepped into when Iris Calloway's desperate message found its way into her possession, and depending on what he discovered, he would either protect her from the storm coming or ensure she disappeared so completely that even he couldn't find the traces. Lila's shift crawled toward 11 o'clock with the slow inevitability of a train approaching a station she couldn't escape. Each ticket she processed felt surreal, her hands moving through transactions while her mind replayed Dorian's words, dissecting every syllable for hidden meaning. The terminal had returned to its normal rhythm after the canceled train. Passengers absorbed back into alternative routes, while security quietly disappeared into whatever shadows they'd emerged from. Nobody mentioned bombs or threats, and the official story would be mechanical failure, safe, boring, forgettable. She'd watched the news on her phone during her break, scrolling through local headlines that said nothing about Grand Central or evacuations. Whatever Dorian had set in motion operated in spaces the public never saw, handled by people whose names never appeared in reports. At 10:47 p.m., her replacement arrived early, a college student named Derek who always smelled like energy drinks and complained about his coursework. Lila handed over the cash drawer with hands steadier than they'd been hours ago, muscle memory overriding the anxiety coiled tight in her chest. "You look exhausted," Derek observed, counting bills with the careless speed of someone who'd never received a warning written on torn currency. "Rough day?" Lila managed something close to a smile, gathering her jacket and bag while avoiding the cameras she'd never paid attention to before today. "Just the usual crowd. Have a good shift." She left through the employee entrance, emerging into the November night where cold air bit through her thin jacket like teeth. The streets around Grand Central thrummed with late-night energy, theater-goers hailing cabs, restaurant workers heading home, delivery trucks unloading supplies for the morning rush. Lila walked 3 blocks before stopping at an all-night diner, sliding into a booth near the back where she could watch the door. She had an hour and 20 minutes to decide if meeting Dorian Maddox was courage or stupidity wrapped in curiosity. The waitress brought coffee without being asked, her name tag reading Gladys above a cartoon smiley face that had faded with decades of washing. Lila wrapped her hands around the mug, letting the heat anchor her to something solid, while her thoughts spiraled through possibilities. Dorian had said to bring nothing that could track her, which meant leaving her phone behind, cutting herself off from any lifeline if the meeting went wrong. But he'd also said the terminal closed at midnight, would be emptied of witnesses and cameras by the time she descended to the oyster bar's tiled archways. She thought about Iris Calloway, the woman whose name she'd learned from evening news that mentioned a body found in Brooklyn with no suspects and no motive. The report had been brief, generic, another violent death in a city that collected them like rainfall. But Iris had known about the bomb, had known about the betrayal, and had chosen Lila as her final messenger to a man who existed in headlines she'd never read and businesses she'd never enter. That choice meant something, suggested Iris had seen something in the ticket clerk who sold her passage to destinations that no longer mattered. Lila pulled out her wallet, extracting the business card she'd found tucked between dollar bills, plain white cardstock with a single phone number printed in black ink. It had appeared in her register sometime during the chaos after Dorian left, slipped there by someone who moved through crowds like whispers. She'd called the number once from the diner's payphone, heard a computerized voice instruct her to meet at the oyster bar at 12:15, then the line went dead. Confirmation that Dorian's world operated in layers most people never penetrated, that today's intersection of their lives was deliberate on his part, accidental on hers. At 11:45 p.m., Lila paid her bill in cash and walked back toward Grand Central, her phone powered down and tucked into her locker at work, where it couldn't follow her into whatever came next. The terminal's main hall was nearly empty now, just scattered travelers and cleaning crews pushing wide mops across marble that had absorbed a century of footsteps. She descended the ramp toward the oyster bar, her footsteps echoing off curved tile ceilings that transformed sound into something haunting and strange. The restaurant had closed hours ago, its famous counter dark, and its tables empty of the lunch crowds that packed it during daylight. Dorian stood near the back archway, his suit jacket gone, and his shirt sleeves rolled to his elbows, in a gesture that felt more dangerous than casual. He'd been waiting, watching her approach with that predatory stillness that suggested he knew exactly how many steps she'd take before reaching him. "You came," he said, and Lila heard the surprise beneath the statement, as if he'd calculated odds, and she'd defied them by appearing. Most people would have walked in the opposite direction and hoped I'd forget their existence. Lila stopped 3 feet away, maintaining distance the way prey maintains distance from apex predators. Instinctive, necessary, insufficient. Most people don't get warnings written on torn money. Most people don't watch security sweep a terminal for bombs that officially don't exist. Something flickered in Dorian's eyes, an emotion she couldn't name but recognized as respect, earned through risk. The woman who gave you that bill, Iris Calloway, died for the information she passed along. Someone put a bullet in her head to keep her silent. The words hit Lila like cold water, confirming what she'd suspected but hadn't wanted to believe. Iris Calloway hadn't been a random victim, hadn't died in a city's casual violence. She'd been executed for choosing salvation over silence. Dorian watched Lila process the information about Iris's death, saw the color drain from her face as understanding crystallized into something sharp and cutting. She didn't faint, didn't cry, didn't demand he take her to the police. She just stood there absorbing the weight of what she'd been pulled into, her dark eyes never leaving his. "Why me?" Lila asked finally, her voice steady despite the tremor he could see in her hands. Iris Calloway didn't know me, had no reason to trust me with something that got her killed. Dorian moved closer, closing the distance to 2 feet, then 18 inches, testing her instinct for self-preservation. "She chose you because you're unremarkable. No criminal connections, no digital footprint worth tracking, no reason for anyone in my organization to pay attention to a ticket clerk who processes hundreds of transactions daily." Lila's chin lifted slightly, defiance sparking in her expression, despite the fear he could smell on her like perfume. "So, I was convenient, random, a body to pass a message through without caring what happened to me afterward." "You were strategic," Dorian corrected, his tone sharpening with something that might have been admiration if he allowed himself such weaknesses. "Iris knew my schedule down to the minute, knew I'd be at your booth at exactly 2:47 p.m., knew you'd understand urgency even if you didn't understand context. She chose well." The oyster bar's tile walls caught their words and threw them back distorted, creating echoes that felt like ghosts of conversations that should have remained private. Dorian had cleared the area, had placed his own security at checkpoints throughout the lower level, but paranoia was survival in his world. "The bomb was planted by someone inside my organization," Dorian continued, pulling out his phone to show Lila surveillance images she had no business seeing. "Someone with access to my schedule, my routes, my habits. Someone who's been planning this for months." Lila studied the photos of the device that would have killed him, her expression shifting from fear to something harder, more focused. "You're telling me this because I'm already involved, whether I want to be or not. Whoever killed Iris might know about me." Dorian pocketed his phone, impressed despite himself by how quickly she'd grasped the implications. "My people scrubbed your digital presence from any connection to me or my businesses. As far as anyone knows, you processed a routine transaction yesterday and nothing more. But yes, if the traitor was watching Iris, they might have seen her pass that bill to the woman in the navy coat." "The woman who gave it to me," Lila finished, her mind clearly working through the chain of custody that had delivered death's warning to Dorian's hands. How many people touched that money between Iris and me? Dorian had reviewed the surveillance footage a dozen times, mapping the path of the torn bill through Grand Central like tracing bullets through flesh. 3. Iris handed it to a courier I've identified as Malcolm Perth, one of my drivers. He gave it to a woman named Bryn Shaw, who works as an administrative assistant in my legal department. Bryn handed it to you. The pattern suggested deliberate compartmentalization, each person knowing only their small piece of a larger puzzle. "Malcolm and Bryn are both dead," Dorian added quietly, watching Lila's face for the moment when survival instinct would override curiosity and send her running. "Found in their apartments within hours of each other. Same execution style as Iris." Lila's breathing quickened, her hand reaching for the archway's wall as if the ground beneath her had suddenly become unstable. 3 people dead for passing a warning, and you think whoever killed them might come after me next. "I know they will," Dorian said, his voice carrying the certainty of someone who'd calculated every variable and found only one conclusion, "which is why you're going to disappear for a while. Go somewhere my people can protect you until I've eliminated the threat." Lila's laugh came sharp and bitter, echoing off tiles that had witnessed a century of conversations, but probably never one quite like this. "You want me to just vanish from my life? Abandon my job, my apartment, everything I know because you have enemies who clean up loose ends?" Dorian closed the remaining distance between them, his presence overwhelming in the confined space of the archway. "I want you to survive what Iris Calloway started when she chose you as her messenger. The alternative is being found in your studio apartment with a bullet in your skull and a news report calling it random violence. Something shifted in Lila's expression, fear transforming into a determination that reminded Dorian of why Iris had picked her. There was steel beneath the ordinary surface, strength that emerged when circumstances demanded it. If I disappear, whoever killed those people wins. They get away with murder and you never find out who betrayed you. This isn't your war, Dorian said. But even as the words left his mouth, he knew they were lies built on wishful thinking. She'd been drafted into this conflict the moment Iris's torn bill landed on her counter, conscripted by circumstance into a battle she hadn't chosen. Lila met his eyes without flinching, and Dorian saw something in her gaze that he recognized because he'd built an empire on it. The refusal to be a victim, the determination to fight even when surrender seemed rational. You need me, she said, her voice gaining strength with each word. I'm the only person who saw everyone involved in that chain. I might have noticed something in their behavior, something that points to who's really behind this. Dorian considered her logic, weighing it against every instinct that said civilians complicated operations and created vulnerabilities. You're asking to become bait, to stay visible while I hunt the traitor, knowing they might come for you first. I'm saying I'm already bait whether you want me to be or not, Lila corrected, her spine straightening as decision crystallized into action. At least if I'm working with you, I have a chance. If I run, I'm just prey with a head start that won't matter. The terminal above them settled into its midnight silence. The last trains departed and the corridors emptying of everyone except security and maintenance crews who knew better than to ask questions. Dorian pulled out a different phone, one of a dozen he rotated through daily, and made a call that lasted 15 seconds. Cole's bringing a car to the 43rd Street exit in 5 minutes, Dorian said, watching Lila absorb this information without protest. You're staying at a property I own in Tribeca tonight, somewhere with security that would make a president jealous. Tomorrow, we figure out which of my people wants me dead badly enough to murder 3 innocents. Lila nodded, her acceptance carrying a finality that suggested she understood there was no going back to the ticket booth and the ordinary life she'd occupied until a torn bill changed everything. What happens when you find them? The traitor? Dorian's expression went cold, the mask he wore in public slipping to reveal the darkness beneath. I handled betrayal the way betrayal always gets handled in my world. Permanently, personally, and with enough brutality that no one else ever considers trying it again. The car waiting at the 43rd Street exit was a black sedan with windows tinted dark enough to violate city ordinances, driven by Cole Brennan, whose assessment of Lila took 3 seconds and communicated volumes without words. He didn't question Dorian's decision to bring her along, didn't ask why a ticket clerk was sliding into the back seat beside his employer. He just drove with the efficiency of someone executing orders he'd learned not to question. Tribeca at 1 a.m. was all shadows and closed galleries, the neighborhood's industrial heritage visible in cobblestone streets, and converted warehouses now worth millions. The building Cole pulled up to looked unremarkable from the outside, its brick facade blending seamlessly with a dozen others on the block. Inside, the elevator required a keycard and a thumbprint, ascending to a penthouse that occupied the building's entire top floor. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered views of the Hudson River, and the furniture looked like it had been selected by someone who understood luxury as utility rather than ostentation. There's food in the kitchen, clothes in the bedroom closet, and a phone on the nightstand that only calls 2 numbers. Mine and Cole's, Dorian said, moving to a laptop set up on the dining table. The windows are bulletproof, the door is steel-reinforced, and there are cameras covering every approach to this building. You're safe here. Lila walked to the windows, looking out at a city that suddenly felt both vast and claustrophobic, full of people living ordinary lives while she stood in a penthouse owned by a man who spoke casually about bulletproof glass. How long have you known someone was trying to kill you? Dorian's fingers moved across the keyboard, pulling up files and surveillance footage that painted pictures of conspiracy in digital form. I've had enemies since I was 16 years old and started building what would become my organization. But this specific betrayal, became apparent 3 weeks ago when money started disappearing from accounts only 5 people have access to. He turned the laptop toward her, showing spreadsheets that meant nothing to Lila but clearly meant everything to him. Someone's been siphoning funds systematically, covering their tracks with false invoices and ghost contractors. The bomb was supposed to be their final move. Eliminate me, blame it on a rival organization, and step into the power vacuum they'd created. Lila studied the numbers, seeing patterns in the chaos that suggested methodical planning over impulsive action. How much money are we talking about? $8 million over 6 months, Dorian said, his tone suggesting this was more insult than injury, that the betrayal stung deeper than the financial loss. Small enough amounts that my accountants didn't flag it immediately, large enough that whoever took it has been planning an exit strategy for a while. Cole emerged from what Lila assumed was a second bedroom, carrying a tablet that he handed to Dorian without comment. Surveillance from Grand Central, cleaned up and enhanced. You're going to want to see this. The footage showed the terminal from multiple angles, time-stamped at 2:43 p.m., 4 minutes before Dorian's usual arrival time. Lila watched herself through the camera's cold eye, processing customers with mechanical efficiency, while the world prepared to tilt sideways. Then, Bryn Shaw appeared, the woman in the navy coat whose face Lila had barely registered in the moment's urgency. Bryn approached the window, her movements normal until the final second when her hand shook, placing the torn bill on the counter, when her eyes darted to the left as if checking for observers. There, Cole said, freezing the frame and zooming in on the reflection in Lila's booth glass. Upper level, near the information kiosk. That's Kieran Graves, your head of East Coast operations. Dorian's expression went glacial as he studied the image of a man Lila had never seen. Tall, expensively dressed, watching Bryn Shaw with the focus of a hawk tracking prey. Kieran's been with me for 12 years. I trusted him with territory that generates $40 million annually. Trusted past tense, Cole observed, his tone suggesting he'd already moved beyond shock to tactical planning. He was watching the handoff, which means he knew about Iris's warning. He probably knew about the bomb, which means he's either the traitor or working with them. Lila's mind raced through implications, connecting dots that formed a picture of conspiracy more complex than a simple assassination attempt. If he knew about the warning, why didn't he stop Bryn from passing it along? Why let it reach Dorian at all? Dorian turned to her with an expression that mixed surprise and approval, as if she'd asked the exact question he'd been circling. Because Kieran couldn't act without exposing himself, Bryn was already moving, already committed to passing the message. Stopping her would have revealed that he knew about the bomb, which would have pointed directly back to him. So he let it play out, Lila continued, her understanding deepening as she worked through the logic. Let the warning reach you, let you cancel the train, and now he's watching to see if you figured out who betrayed you. He's playing both sides, looking loyal by not interfering while actually orchestrating everything. Cole's tablet lit up with an incoming message, his eyes scanning text that made his jaw tighten. Kieran just left his apartment in the Upper East Side. 3 men with him, all armed, all from his personal security detail. They're heading downtown. Dorian moved to a safe hidden behind a painting of the Brooklyn Bridge, extracting a handgun that he checked with practiced efficiency before tucking it into a shoulder holster. He knows we found the bomb, knows we're investigating, and he's making his move before we can make ours. Cole, how many people can you have at this location in 10 minutes? 15. All vetted. All loyal to you personally rather than to territory or operations, Cole replied, already sending messages that would mobilize forces Lila couldn't see, but could suddenly feel pressing in around her. But if Kieran's coming here, he knows about the girl. Someone told him she's with you. The implication settled over the penthouse like fog, cold and suffocating. Lila had been visible for hours, walking to the diner, returning to Grand Central, emerging at the 43rd Street exit. Kieran's people could have been watching the entire time, tracking her movements and reporting back to someone who'd built betrayal into an art form. We evacuate, Dorian said, his decision made in the space between heartbeats. Take Lila to the Jersey City Safehouse. Keep her there with a team that's never worked the East Coast territory. If Kieran's compromised my security here, we assume he's compromised everything connected to Manhattan operations. Lila found her voice despite the fear trying to strangle it. If you run now, you lose the advantage. Kieran doesn't know that you know about him. He thinks he's still hidden, still playing loyal lieutenant while planning your death. Use that. Dorian crossed the room in 3 strides, stopping close enough that Lila could see the calculations happening behind his eyes. You want me to let him come here? Turn this penthouse into a battlefield with you as potential collateral damage? I want you to end this tonight, Lila said, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. Because every day this continues is another day Iris, Malcolm, and Bryn died for nothing. Another day you're looking over your shoulder instead of running your empire. Another day I'm a loose end someone wants to tie off permanently. Cole looked between them, his expression suggesting he recognized the shift happening in real time, the civilian becoming something else, something harder and more dangerous than her circumstances should have forged. She's right. If we run now, Kieran disappears, and we spend months hunting him while he rebuilds elsewhere. If we end it tonight, we send a message that reaches every corner of your organization. Dorian's phone buzzed with an update from security teams positioning throughout Tribeca, chess pieces moving into formation for a game that would end in blood or betrayal revealed. Lila stays in the panic room, reinforced steel, separate ventilation, stocked for a week-long siege if necessary. She's not participating, not taking risks, not becoming another body I have to explain to authorities who pretend not to know what I do. Lila nodded, accepting the compromise because she understood it was the only one he'd offer. When this is over, when Kieran's handled and the threats eliminated, what happens to me? Do I go back to selling tickets like none of this happened? The question hung between them, weighted with implications neither had time to explore. Dorian's expression softened fractionally, revealing something beneath the calculated exterior. Concern, perhaps, or the recognition that some intersections couldn't be undone regardless of how much distance you tried to place between before and after. When this is over, we figure out what comes next, Dorian said finally, his hand touching her shoulder in a gesture that felt both protective and possessive. But first, we make sure there is a next for both of us. Cole, show her the panic room. I have a traitor to welcome home. The panic room occupied what appeared to be a closet off the master bedroom, but Cole's thumbprint revealed a space large enough to hold 8 people comfortably, lined with monitors showing every angle of the penthouse and the streets below. Lila stepped inside, feeling the weight of the steel door as it closed behind her, sealing her into safety that felt uncomfortably like a tomb. Through the monitors, she watched Dorian move through the penthouse with Cole, their coordination speaking to years of partnership built on trust and shared violence. They positioned themselves with the tactical precision of soldiers, turning luxury furniture into cover and sightlines into kill zones. Dorian's phone lit up with a message that made his expression harden into something frightening. Kieran's car had entered Tribeca, moving slowly as if the occupants were checking addresses and calculating approaches. 3 minutes, maybe 4, before the confrontation that would end in revelation or death. Lila's hands gripped the edge of the monitor desk, her heart hammering as she watched the street camera pick up the black SUV pulling to a stop 2 buildings away. 4 men emerged, Kieran's tall frame unmistakable even in the grainy footage, moving with confidence that suggested he believed surprise was still his advantage. The building's lobby camera showed them entering, Kieran speaking to the night security guard with the easy authority of someone who'd visited before and expected no resistance. But the guard's hand moved beneath his desk, pressing an alert that turned a hallway light red, a signal Dorian had clearly arranged in advance. Dorian's voice came through the panic room's speaker, calm, despite the violence approaching his doorstep. Lila, whatever happens in the next 10 minutes, you stay in that room until I come get you personally. If anyone else tries to open that door, there's a weapon in the drawer to your left and instructions to use it. She found the gun exactly where he'd indicated, its weight foreign and terrifying in her hands. The instructions were printed on laminated paper, step-by-step directions for someone who'd never held a weapon. Safety off, aim center mass, squeeze don't pull, keep squeezing until the threat stops moving. The elevator camera showed Kieran and his men ascending, their weapons drawn now that pretense had been abandoned. Kieran's face filled the screen for a moment, and Lila saw something in his expression that chilled her. Not anger or desperation, but excitement, as if he'd been waiting for this confrontation and relished its arrival. The elevator doors opened directly into the penthouse, and Kieran stepped out with the confidence of someone entering territory he believed he'd already conquered. "Dorian," he called out, his voice carrying across the open space. "I know you're here. I know about the girl. We need to talk before this gets messier than it needs to be." Dorian emerged from behind the kitchen island, his weapon lowered but ready, his posture radiating controlled danger. "The bomb on the 315 Express, that was your idea? Or someone else's? I'm curious how much of my organization's betrayal carries your fingerprints." Kieran's smile held no warmth, just the satisfaction of a plan executed despite unexpected complications. "The bomb was necessary once I realized Iris had figured out the money trail. She was always too smart for her own good, too loyal to you to ignore what she'd discovered. I couldn't risk her talking. So you killed her," Dorian said, his words falling like stones into still water. "Executed a woman who'd worked for me faithfully for 8 years, because she threatened your theft and your ambition. Then you killed Malcolm and Bryn to cover the trail of that torn bill." Kieran moved further into the penthouse, his men fanning out with professional efficiency that spoke to military training. "I built the East Coast territory into what it is today. I generated the revenue that paid for this penthouse, for your cars, for the empire you parade around like you earned it alone. And my reward was watching you keep all the power, while I did all the work. Cole appeared from the bedroom hallway, his weapon trained on the nearest of Kieran's men with the steadiness of someone who'd done this before. You had $40 million in annual revenue, a penthouse of your own, and respect from every organization from Boston to Miami. Greed made you stupid, Kieran. Greed and the delusion that you could take what Dorian built without him noticing. The standoff crystallized into something almost formal, 4 armed men on one side and 2 on the other, with Lila watching through monitors that showed angles security cameras weren't meant to capture. She could see Dorian's finger resting along his weapon's frame, not on the trigger yet, but ready to move in fractions of seconds. Kieran's expression shifted from confidence to something harder as he realized Dorian had been prepared for this confrontation. You knew I was coming. Someone talked. Someone in my crew betrayed me the way I betrayed you. The symmetry is almost poetic. Nobody betrayed you, Dorian corrected, his tone carrying finality that made the temperature in the room seem to drop. I've known about your theft for 3 weeks, known about your plans for 10 days, known you were the traitor since surveillance footage showed you watching Bryn pass that warning. You're not here because you have power. You're here because I let you come, because ending this required you feeling confident enough to walk into a trap. The realization that he'd been outmaneuvered hit Kieran like physical force, his confidence cracking to reveal panic underneath. His weapon came up fast, but Dorian was faster. 3 shots that sounded like thunder in the enclosed space, placing bullets exactly where military training dictated. Kieran fell backward, his gun clattering across marble floors that had cost more than most people earned in years. Kieran's men froze as doors opened throughout the penthouse, revealing the 15 people Cole had positioned in adjacent apartments and hallways, their weapons trained on the intruders with the coordination of a rehearsed performance. Surrender happened in stages, weapons lowered, hands raised, the mathematics of survival overriding loyalty to a dead employer. Lila watched through the monitors as Dorian approached Kieran's body, checking for a pulse he clearly didn't expect to find. The confrontation had lasted less than 2 minutes from first shot to final breath, violence compressed into moments that would reshape everything that came after. Cole was already on his phone, making calls that would bring cleaners and lawyers, people who specialized in making bodies disappear, and stories align with whatever official narrative served Dorian's interests. Kieran's men were escorted out by security who would ensure their silence through methods Lila didn't want to imagine. The panic room's door unlocked with a soft click, and Dorian appeared in the doorway, his shirt stained with blood that might have been his own or Kieran's. Lila couldn't tell and wasn't sure she wanted to know. "It's over," he said simply, exhaustion bleeding through his controlled exterior for the first time since they'd met. Lila set down the weapon she'd been gripping hard enough to leave impressions in her palms, her hands shaking with delayed adrenaline as reality crashed over her in waves. The others, Kieran's men, what happens to them? They'll be questioned, assessed for loyalty or complicity, then either integrated back into the organization under different management, or dealt with according to what we learn, Dorian answered, his honesty brutal and refreshing. Some knew about the betrayal, some were just following orders. The difference matters in my world. She stepped out of the panic room into a penthouse that smelled like gunpowder and consequences, where luxury furniture had been transformed into cover, and pristine floors now bore scuff marks from violence. The body was already gone, removed with efficiency that suggested this wasn't the first time Dorian's people had cleaned up after confrontations. Dorian poured himself bourbon from a crystal decanter that had somehow survived the chaos, offering Lila a glass she accepted, despite never developing a taste for expensive liquor. You should have been terrified in there, should have been crying, or demanding I take you to police who couldn't protect you even if they wanted to. I was terrified, Lila admitted, the bourbon burning her throat as she swallowed courage she didn't feel. But terror doesn't change what happened, doesn't bring back Iris or Malcolm or Bryn, doesn't undo the fact that I handed you a torn bill and stepped into your world without permission or preparation. Dorian studied her with an intensity that felt different from his earlier assessments, as if he was seeing her clearly for the first time despite hours spent in close proximity. Most civilians fold when they see violence, when theoretical danger becomes bodies and blood. You watched through those monitors and held a weapon you'd never fired, ready to use it if necessary. Survival isn't the same as bravery, Lila countered, but even as the words left her mouth, she knew they were deflection. She had been brave in the panic room, had made choices that went against every instinct for self-preservation. What happens now? Kieran's dead, his theft exposed, his betrayal ended. Do I go back to Grand Central and pretend this was an extended sick day? Dorian's expression shifted into something that might have been amusement if circumstances allowed for humor. Your booth was reassigned yesterday to permanent staff, and your employee file shows you resigned for personal reasons effective immediately. You don't work at Grand Central anymore. You don't exist in any system Kieran's remaining associates could access to find you. The information should have angered her, should have felt like another violation of autonomy in a day full of them. Instead, Lila felt something close to relief. The ticket booth had been safety built on routine, but it had also been a cage she'd never quite noticed until circumstances forced her through its bars. Dawn broke over Manhattan with the indifference of a city that had witnessed countless dawns before, sunlight painting the Hudson River in shades of gold that transformed industrial waterfront into something almost beautiful. Lila stood at the penthouse windows watching the transformation, still wearing yesterday's clothes and carrying yesterday's fear like a weight that hadn't yet dissolved. Dorian emerged from the bedroom wearing fresh clothes, his appearance back to the controlled perfection she'd first noticed through her ticket booth glass. Cole arranged an apartment for you in Brooklyn. Park Slope, Dorman Building, security that doesn't advertise itself but exists in layers. It's yours for as long as you need it. No obligations beyond staying alive. The offer landed between them like a bridge she could choose to cross or burn, and Lila turned from the windows to meet his eyes directly. You're offering me protection, because I helped you, because Iris chose me as her messenger. That's obligation dressed up as generosity. I'm offering you protection because you earned it by not running when running would have been rational, Dorian corrected, closing the distance between them until they stood close enough that she could see the exhaustion he was fighting to hide. And because somewhere between you handing me that torn bill and watching you hold a weapon in a panic room, this stopped being about obligation and became about something I don't have words for yet. Lila's breath caught at the admission, at the vulnerability visible in a man who'd built walls higher and stronger than most people could imagine. Your world killed 3 people yesterday, almost killed dozens more on that train, and ended with you shooting someone in your own penthouse. That's not a world I know how to exist in. It's not a world anyone should have to exist in, Dorian agreed, his hand reaching up to brush a strand of hair from her face with surprising gentleness. But it's the world I inhabit. And yesterday it became the world you inhabit too, whether either of us planned for that intersection. The question isn't whether you can exist in it. You already proved you can. The question is whether you want to. The choice he was offering felt impossibly large, a decision that would reshape her life in ways she couldn't predict or control. The ticket booth had been safe, predictable, boring in ways that suddenly seemed appealing compared to penthouses with panic rooms and men who spoke casually about eliminating threats. But safety had also been small, contained, a life lived through glass watching other people travel to destinations, while she remained stationary. Yesterday had been terrifying, but it had also been vivid, colors brighter, sounds sharper, every moment carrying weight that routine had leached from her existence years ago. I want the apartment in Park Slope, Lila said finally, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was choosing. I want time to process what happened. To grieve for people I never met, but whose deaths made my survival possible. And then I want to understand what comes next, what it means to exist in your world, without losing myself entirely. Then, Dorian's expression softened into something that resembled relief, as if he'd been prepared for her to walk away, and was surprised by her decision to stay within reach. Cole's waiting downstairs with a car. He'll take you to the apartment, get you settled, make sure you have everything you need. I have meetings throughout the day, damage control, reassignments, conversations with people who need to understand that betrayal carries permanent consequences. Lila nodded, accepting the separation as necessary, even as part of her wanted to protest being left alone with thoughts that would inevitably spiral toward darkness. When you're done with meetings and consequences, will you come find me? Not as protection or obligation, but because you want to figure out what this is between us? Yes, Dorian said simply, the word carrying promise and possibility in equal measure. He leaned forward, pressing a kiss to her forehead that felt both chaste and intimate, a gesture that acknowledged connection without demanding more than she was ready to give. Get some rest, Lila Blake. Yesterday changed everything, but tomorrow doesn't have to be navigated alone. She left the penthouse with Cole, descending in an elevator that required security clearance to operate, emerging into a morning that felt surreal after the violence and revelation of the previous hours. The car ride to Brooklyn was silent, Cole respecting her need for quiet while Manhattan gave way to brownstones and tree-lined streets. The Park Slope apartment was smaller than the penthouse but exponentially larger than her studio in Queens, furnished with care that suggested someone had anticipated her needs before she'd known to articulate them. Cole handed her keys, and a phone programmed with 2 numbers, repeating Dorian's earlier instructions about security and safety, with the patience of someone executing orders he considered important. When Cole left, Lila stood in the center of her new living room, surrounded by furniture she hadn't chosen and views she'd never imagined having. The silence felt enormous after yesterday's chaos, and she found herself crying for the first time since the torn bill had landed on her counter. Tears for Iris, Malcolm, and Bryn, for the life she'd left behind, and for the uncertain future she'd chosen despite every rational argument against it. Her phone buzzed with a text from the number labeled simply D, 3 words that carried more weight than their brevity suggested. "Thank you. Sleep well." Lila typed a response with hands that had finally stopped shaking. "See you tomorrow." She slept through most of the day, exhaustion claiming her in waves that pulled her under before surfacing could be considered. When she woke at dusk, the apartment's windows framed a Brooklyn sunset that painted the sky in colors that felt like hope, despite everything. Orange and pink and purple bleeding together into something beautiful and temporary and entirely new. Thank you all for following this story. If you're enjoying it, write in the comments from where you're watching, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and share the video. Your support means everything and helps me continue bringing you stories like Lila and Dorian's. See you in the next one.